It was a cloudy Tuesday morning. The sky was gray, and the air felt heavy, like something big was about to happen. People walked quickly down Main Street, their coats pulled tight against the cool breeze. Among them was Olivia Walker. She held a simple briefcase in her hand and walked with purpose, though she didn't look like she was in a hurry. She looked calm, like someone who didn't want to stand out. In a squad car parked nearby, two police officers sat watching the street. Officer Carter tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, bored. Officer Hayes sipped his coffee and glanced at the passing people. Then they saw Olivia. To them, she didn't seem special. She was just another woman walking down the street, someone who wouldn't cause any trouble. "Let's check her out," Carter said with a shrug. Hayes nodded, not thinking twice about it. They had no idea who she was. They didn't know what she carried in her briefcase or the secret she held in her heart. To them, she was just another face in the crowd. Olivia noticed the squad car as she walked by, but she didn't stop or slow down. She kept her head high and her steps steady. She wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble always seemed to find her. She had learned long ago to stay calm, no matter what. People often judged her without knowing her, and she had grown used to it. But today, something told her this would be different. To most people, Olivia seemed quiet and shy. She didn't draw attention to herself. She dressed simply and spoke softly, never raising her voice. People often overlooked her, thinking she wasn't important. But Olivia knew the truth. Beneath her calm and quiet appearance, she was strong. She had faced challenges before and had learned how to handle herself. As the squad car's lights flashed behind her, Olivia felt her stomach tighten. She took a deep breath and stopped walking. The officers stepped out of the car and walked toward her. They had stern looks on their faces, and their voices were firm. "Ma'am, can we ask you a few questions?" Carter said. Olivia turned to face them, her expression calm. She didn't argue or raise her voice. She just nodded and waited for them to speak. The officers asked where she was going and why she was walking alone. They didn't say why they had stopped her, but Olivia could feel their suspicion. They treated her like she was someone who didn't belong, someone they needed to watch closely. Inside, Olivia felt a mix of anger and sadness. She wanted to tell them who she was, to make them see her as more than just a random person on the street. But she held back. She had learned to pick her battles, and this wasn't the time to reveal her true self. Instead, she answered their questions calmly, keeping her voice steady. The officers finally let her go, but not before giving her a warning tone. They walked back to their car, talking quietly and shaking their heads. Olivia watched them drive away, her heart beating fast. She took another deep breath and straightened her shoulders. They didn't know her story. They didn't know that one day, they would see her again, and when they did, they would finally understand just how wrong they had been. The patrol car's lights began to flash, filling the quiet street with red and blue. Olivia's heart sank. She gripped the steering wheel tightly and took a deep breath. She knew what was coming. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to her. As she pulled her car over to the side of the road, she glanced in her rearview mirror. Two officers, Carter and Hayes, stepped out of the patrol car. Their steps were slow, their faces serious. Olivia noticed the way they carried themselves, confident, almost smug. They acted like they had already made up their minds about her, and she hadn't even said a word. Officer Carter approached her window and tapped on the glass. Olivia rolled it down, her hands steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "License and registration," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. Olivia nodded and handed him the documents without hesitation. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely, her tone calm but firm. Carter didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over the papers, his eyebrows slightly raised. Then, Without explanation, he waved Officer Hayes over. Hayes stood on the other side of Olivia's car, peering in through the passenger window. "Step out of the vehicle," Carter said suddenly. His words weren't a request, they were an order. Olivia hesitated for a moment, her stomach tightening further. She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't been speeding, she hadn't broken any rules. But she knew better than to argue. Arguing wouldn't help her. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car. The officers didn't explain why they had stopped her. Instead, they began searching her car. They opened her trunk, looked through her belongings, and even unzipped her briefcase. Olivia watched, her hands clenched at her sides. "What are you looking for?" she asked, her voice still calm but tinged with frustration. Neither officer answered. They ignored her questions as if she hadn't spoken at all. Their silence felt heavy, almost like a challenge. Olivia wanted to demand answers, to stand up for herself. But she knew this wasn't the time. She stood quietly, watching as they rifled through her things. Her patience was being tested, and so was her dignity. Every move they made seemed designed to remind her that they held the power in this moment. When they finally finished, Carter handed her back her documents without even a glance. "You're free to go," he said flatly, as if he had done her a favor. Olivia took the papers and returned to her car. She sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring straight ahead. Her heart was still racing, but she refused to let them see how shaken she felt. She started the engine and drove away, her mind swirling with thoughts. She didn't know why they had stopped her, but she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. One day, they would see her again. And when they did, they would finally understand that she wasn't someone to dismiss so easily. Olivia stood on the side of the road, her head held high even though her heart was beating fast. She could feel the weight of their stares and hear the tone in their voices, cold, sharp, and full of judgment. Officer Carter and Officer Hayes looked at her like they already knew her, like they had already decided she was just another person who didn't matter. They talked to her as if she wasn't smart, as if she wasn't important. Carter smirked as he wrote the ticket, his pen moving slowly, like he wanted to drag out the moment. Hayes stood nearby with his arms crossed, glancing at her every so often. Their words weren't loud, but they were full of meaning, snide comments, little jokes they thought she wouldn't catch. Olivia didn't let them see how their words stung. She stayed calm, her face steady, her voice quiet but clear. She answered their questions politely and didn't argue, even when she wanted to. Inside, though, she was taking it all in. Every sneer, every dismissive tone, every smirk, they were all burned into her memory. She noticed how Carter leaned against her car, acting like he had all the time in the world. She noticed how Hayes avoided looking her in the eye, like he was too busy pretending to be in control. They thought they had all the power in that moment, and maybe they did. But Olivia knew something they didn't. This wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. When Carter finally handed her the ticket, he didn't even look up. "Here you go," he said with a smirk. "Make sure you show up to court." The way he said it made it clear he didn't think she would. As she took the ticket, Olivia noticed the way Hayes chuckled under his breath. Carter turned to him and said, "She probably won't even bother. They never do." Hayes laughed along, as if it was the funniest thing he'd heard all day. Olivia didn't say a word. She simply nodded, folded the ticket, and put it in her bag. She got back in her car and drove away, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her heart was still racing, but it wasn't just from anger or frustration. It was from determination. As she drove, Olivia thought about everything that had just happened. She thought about the way they looked at her, the way they talked to her, and the way they assumed she was powerless. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know what she was capable of. And they certainly didn't know that when her court date arrived, she would be the one sitting in the judge's chair. She smiled to herself as the thought crossed her mind. They believed they had all the power, but they were wrong. Olivia had plans they couldn't even begin to imagine. And when the time came, she would show them just how wrong they had been about her. The courtroom was alive with the low hum of voices as people shuffled in, taking their seats. Papers rustled, lawyers whispered to their clients, and the sound of the gavel echoed faintly from another courtroom down the hall. It was just another busy day in the courthouse, or so it seemed. Officer Carter and Officer Hayes strolled in with a casual air, their uniforms crisp, their badges shining. They exchanged a quick smirk, feeling confident. They were here to explain their actions, but to them, it was just a routine matter. After all, who could question their authority? As they walked toward their seats, they didn't pay much attention to the bench at the front of the room. Why would they? It was always the same, a judge sitting high, ready to listen, maybe nodding off between cases. But today was not like any other day. The bailiff's voice suddenly rang out, loud and clear. "All rise," he said firmly, his words cutting through the chatter. The room fell silent as everyone stood. Carter and Hayes glanced up toward the bench and froze. There, standing tall, was Olivia Walker. She adjusted the black robe on her shoulders and looked out over the courtroom. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a quiet fire. Carter's smirk disappeared in an instant. Hayes blinked, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Olivia let the moment hang in the air. She met their stunned gazes and then sat down, her movements slow and deliberate. The power dynamic in the room shifted completely. The two officers, who had once towered over her with arrogance, now looked small and uncertain. "Gentlemen," Olivia began, her voice steady but firm. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Every word she spoke carried weight. "We have a matter to address today." Carter and Hayes exchanged nervous glances. The confidence they had walked in with was gone. Carter shifted uncomfortably, while Hayes avoided looking at Olivia altogether. They were no longer in control of the situation. They were no longer the ones with the power. Olivia continued, her tone professional yet sharp. "This courtroom is a place of law, fairness, and respect," she said, pausing to let her words sink in. "It is not a place for assumptions or abuses of power." The room was silent, except for the faint scribbling of a court reporter's pen. Every eye was on Olivia, and every ear was listening. Carter opened his mouth, as if to speak, but quickly closed it again. Hayes shifted in his seat, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Olivia didn't rush. She took her time, recounting the events of that day in detail. Her voice never wavered, and she never looked away from the two men who had once treated her with such disdain. As she spoke, the weight of their actions became clear not just to the courtroom, but to Carter and Hayes themselves. By the time Olivia finished, there was no doubt who held the power in the room. She sat back, her gaze steady. The courtroom remained silent, heavy with the realization of what had just unfolded. Carter and Hayes had come to court ready to defend their actions. But now, they sat before the very woman they had dismissed and belittled, knowing they had been wrong, terribly wrong. Officer Carter shifted nervously in his seat, holding a folder of papers in his hands. His usual confident smirk was gone, replaced by a look of worry. He cleared his throat and began to speak, but his words came out shaky. "Your Honor," he said, glancing at Olivia, "we were just doing our job." He tried to explain his actions, saying it was routine, that stopping Olivia on the street was nothing personal. But the words didn't sound convincing, not even to him. His sentences stumbled over each other, and he kept glancing at Hayes as if looking for help. Officer Hayes sat next to him, pretending to stay calm. But the way he wiped his forehead and tapped his foot gave him away. Sweat glistened on his brow, and his eyes darted around the courtroom. He avoided looking at Olivia altogether, as if her steady gaze was too much to bear. Olivia sat behind the bench, her face calm and unreadable. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her silence made the room feel heavy. Everyone waited for her to speak, but she let Carter and Hayes finish their awkward explanations first. When they finally stopped, Olivia leaned forward slightly. Her voice was steady, but it carried an unmistakable authority. "Officers," she began, "this courtroom is a place where fairness and justice must come first." Her words echoed in the silent room. Carter swallowed hard, and Hayes shifted in his seat. "On the day you stopped me," Olivia continued, "you didn't treat me with fairness. You didn't see me as a person. You saw only what you assumed about me. And those assumptions led to actions that were both wrong and unfair." Carter opened his mouth to respond, but Olivia raised a hand, stopping him. "You both had power in that moment," she said. "But with power comes responsibility. And the responsibility of a police officer is to serve and protect everyone, not just those who look or act a certain way." Her words hung in the air, heavy and meaningful. Carter looked down at the table, his face flushed. Hayes finally met her eyes, but only for a moment before looking away again. Olivia continued, her tone never wavering. "However, this courtroom is not a place for revenge. It is a place for the truth. And the truth is, your actions that day violated not only my rights but also the principles you swore to uphold as officers of the law." She paused, letting her words sink in. Then, she delivered her ruling. "Because of this, I am ordering additional training for both of you, focusing on bias and respectful community policing. I am also filing this incident as a formal record in your personnel files." Carter and Hayes looked stunned. They had come to court expecting to walk out unscathed, but now the weight of their actions was clear. Olivia didn't shout or use harsh words, she didn't have to. Her calm, firm tone spoke louder than anything else. As the hearing ended, Carter and Hayes stood and walked out of the courtroom, their heads hanging low. They knew they had been exposed, their mistakes laid bare for all to see. Olivia watched them leave, then gathered her papers. She felt a sense of peace, knowing she had done what was right not just for herself but for everyone who deserved fairness and justice. The room slowly emptied, but her words stayed, lingering in the air like a quiet reminder: justice is for everyone, and no one is above it. Olivia sat quietly for a moment, watching as the two officers walked out of the courtroom. Their shoulders were slumped, their steps slow. They didn't look back. The once confident men who had mocked and underestimated her were now walking away with their heads low, their pride shaken. The room had grown quiet. The chatter that had filled the courtroom earlier was gone. The people who remained sat still, their eyes fixed on Olivia. Some of them looked thoughtful, others nodded slightly, as if they understood the deeper meaning of what had just happened. Olivia took a deep breath and looked around the room. She didn't feel the need to say anything else. She didn't need to explain her actions or speak about what had happened. Her choices, her calm strength, and her fairness had said everything for her. Sometimes, actions spoke louder than words ever could. As she stood and gathered her papers, Olivia's thoughts turned inward. She remembered all the times in her life when she had been judged unfairly, overlooked, or treated poorly because of assumptions others had made about her. She thought of all the moments when people had tried to put her down, thinking she wouldn't fight back. But Olivia had always stood tall. She had learned that real strength didn't come from yelling or demanding attention. It came from staying steady, calm, and true to what was right. It came from letting your actions prove your worth, even when others doubted you. Power isn't about who shouts the loudest, she thought, a small smile forming on her lips. It's about who stands tallest, even in silence. That simple thought gave her peace. She had faced a difficult moment and come through it not with anger, but with strength and dignity. She had shown the world and herself that standing up for what was right didn't mean you had to fight with loud words or aggressive actions. It meant staying true to your values, even when it was hard. As Olivia walked out of the courtroom, she felt a sense of pride and calm. She didn't just feel proud because she had stood up for herself. She felt proud because she had proven that fairness and justice could still win, even in situations that seemed unfair or unkind. The sunlight outside was warm on her face as she stepped onto the courthouse steps. She paused for a moment, looking up at the sky. The clouds that had filled the sky earlier were gone now, replaced by clear, open blue. It felt like a sign, a reminder that even after a storm, light can shine through. Olivia walked away, her steps steady and sure. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. It was about justice, fairness, and the quiet strength it takes to stand up for what's right. And that day, Olivia proved something important, not just to the officers, not just to the people in the courtroom, but to herself. She proved that justice can shine, even in the darkest moments. And when it does, it lights the way for everyone.